The Pittsburgh Steelers are now, well, looking for a wide receiver in the first round, I guess. At least that's what the latest big mock draft says. What's going on, everybody? I'm Noah Strackbine. Thank you for jumping on to Steelers to Go, your daily to-go cup of Pittsburgh Steelers news and analysis. Find us on youtube.com/all Steelers talk and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. And today we're talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers and their apparent attraction to a wide receiver in the first round. According to Mel Kiper Jr.'s latest mock draft, and say what you will about Mel Kiper Jr. and his mock drafts and whether you rely on them or just make fun of them, they're there. And they're in the industry as big as it gets. And he says that the Steelers at pick 17 will select Boston College wide receiver Zay Flowers over a very interesting name in Paris Johnson. Why? Because the Steelers need a wide receiver and they've been open about adding a wide receiver. And I think that's where we start here. I believe this is threefold. I believe that the Pittsburgh Steelers' interest in my lack of belief in the Steelers' interest in a slot wide receiver in the 17th pick has three reasons behind it. But let's start with what we know. The Pittsburgh Steelers from the jump have had a very interesting timeline and things to say about their wide receiver position. It started at Art Rooney's postseason media session where he told me directly that the Steelers are very comfortable with the guys that they already have in the locker room, that they feel comfortable and they feel good about the direction that the skill positions are going in, and that if they had to make a decision, they feel that a lot of them are young and will return. None of them returned. The Steelers are down to Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Calvin Austin, Gunnar Olszewski, and Anthony Miller as their wide receiver core. And yes, Calvin Austin has a lot of upside, and there was some serious expectations for him coming into last season, and I believe that those expectations should still be there. I get it. A foot injury is tough. A Liz Frank injury is even worse. But this guy had so much going for him last summer that I have a hard time believing that it's all just going to evaporate this year. Anthony Miller, a second-round pick. The guy never really panned out in Pittsburgh and hasn't played a game for them in a regular season game or an active roster game at all. But it's Anthony Miller, and it's a second-round pick. And from time to time, you have to believe that there is some potential there. And then Gunnar Olszewski, well, he did absolutely nothing when it came to catching the football last season and has stayed that way throughout his entire career, but he's a phenomenal run blocker, and he has a role in the offense. But the Steelers, they really only have two wide receivers right now and then a couple of question marks. But Art Rooney said that, well, they're young and everybody feels good about it. And I thought that he was talking about a guy like Steven Sims, who's gone. Miles Boykin, who's gone. Not about Calvin Austin, Gunnar Olszewski, and Anthony Miller. And if this is the crew, I don't think Art Rooney saw it coming. Then you fast forward to the annual owners meetings where Omar Khan said that the Steelers are very much so interested in a slot wide receiver, but they want, quote unquote, their wide receiver. And immediately those speculations arose. People, including myself, started jumping on there has to be a certain type of wide receiver. And if you follow the Pittsburgh Steelers trend, it's not Zay Flowers. Who it is a Juju Smith-Schuster type guy, a Chase Claypool type guy. These big bodies in the middle that the Pittsburgh Steelers have tried to make work at slot receiver and have been unsuccessful doing so. So maybe they're learning and adjusting and changing their ways and looking for a fast, speedy guy, much like Calvin Austin. Or they're interested in the big body guys like Jonathan Mingo, who they brought in for a pre-draft visit. But it goes deeper than that. It goes deeper than just what we know about the Pittsburgh Steelers and their wide receiver position. The fact that 17 is sitting there and Zay Flowers is the selection over Paris Johnson, which does not make much sense. And it doesn't make much sense because the Pittsburgh Steelers have shown a bit of their draft hand, and we could compare it to Kenny Pickett last year. I think that's the new favorite thing to do is to say, well, the Steelers didn't do any homework on Kenny Pickett. They didn't even let him know that they were interested in him at all. They were taking all these quarterbacks out to dinner and bringing them in for pre-draft visits. And Mike Tomlin was all bonkers over Malik Willis, but Kenny Pickett was secretly their guy. That could be the same thing this year. It's not. The Steelers had such an advantage last year when it came to scouting Kenny Pickett and keeping that low key that they took full advantage of that advantage. The Steelers did not need to bring Kenny Pickett in for a pre-draft visit because Matt Canada went and hung out with them for 10 minutes next door. Got to know everything he needed to know in a pre-draft visit. Mike Tomlin has been scouting and talking to this guy at practice for years now. Pat Narduzzi and Mike Tomlin are great friends, and a scouting report from your coach, who's also a very good friend and a successful member of NCAA football, well, that's a reliable source if you're Mike Tomlin. You didn't need to do any scouting on Kenny Pickett. You knew who Kenny Pickett was going into the draft process. You needed to evaluate everybody else to assure that Kenny Pickett was your guy. This year, people are going to toss out, and Mel Kiper Jr. tossed out, well, Dino Tomlin plays for Boston College, so Mike Tomlin has to have some familiarity with Zay Flowers. And he probably does. And he's probably been at a game or two where Zay Flowers went off for bonkers yards and a couple of touchdowns and showed, hey, I'm a first-round pick. And Mike Tomlin was probably very, very impressed by that. But overall, the Pittsburgh Steelers have done much more homework on much other, and in my opinion, better fits than Zay Flowers, especially at pick 17. They met with Flowers at the NFL Combine, but they didn't attend his pro day. They didn't invite him to a pre-draft visit. Meanwhile, they've put a bunch of attention into Jonathan Mingo. They've put a bunch of attention into a guy like Josh Downs. They've done their homework on different wide receivers more than they have Zay Flowers. So you look at Zay Flowers and you say, well, then they're taking a risk at 17. And I'd feel comfortable with that because I think that 17 is a dead zone for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I just think that it doesn't offer much potential. I think it's a very no man's land right now where, yeah, maybe a top tackle slides or a top cornerback slides, but maybe you're sitting there and Zay Flowers is your best option at 17. In this mock draft, he's not. Paris Johnson easily is. And if Paris Johnson slides to 17, you select Paris Johnson, and the Pittsburgh Steelers know that. They wouldn't question that for a second. It's why there's reports saying that they're talking or have spoken to the Chicago Bears about moving up. You think they're moving up to go get Zay Flowers or maybe Christian Gonzalez, possibly a corner, I guess. But realistically, it's Paris Johnson. Realistically, it's a left tackle and somebody that they believe is a franchise player that they could get at pick 9. At 17, if Paris Johnson's there, that's the biggest steal in the draft. And I do have upside and I do have a good outlook on Zay Flowers, but Paris Johnson is a better player and he's a more reliable pick and he fits the Steelers' needs way more, which brings us to our final point, our 3-part. This is why the Steelers do not target a wide receiver in the first round, even if Mel Kiper Jr. believes that they do. It's the fact that the Steelers, yeah, they have a need at wide receiver, and it's a pretty big one. The Steelers do not have a reliable slot wide receiver, and Calvin Austin, I have a huge outlook on Calvin Austin's future, but in Pittsburgh, you earn anything that you get, and Calvin Austin hasn't earned anything at all. So the Steelers are going to make him earn whatever he gets. But the Steelers don't utilize slot wide receivers, not Matt Canada's offense. Really, they don't utilize the middle of the field at all. And they do from time to time. And when Matt Canada gets pressed enough about it by the media, he tends to change his outlook on this offense. But for the most part, the Steelers don't utilize their slot wide receiver unless it's running the football. The Steelers don't utilize the middle of the field unless it's a dramatic situation and they need a first down. The Steelers don't have a pressing need for a player in the first round except for on paper. Because on paper, you say, well, you need a slot receiver. But in Matt Canada's offense, that slot wide receiver isn't going to do much. And you could say maybe things will change, and maybe they will. But until they do, you can't expect them to. Until they do, you can't look at this offense and say, well, if you add Zay Flowers, you have to make plays for Zay Flowers. I agree with that notion, but I don't have the expectations that it'll happen. And until it does, and until proven otherwise, you have to look at this offense and say, is wide receiver that big of a pressing need, or would it be a pressing need for every other team? because in Pittsburgh, they have their guys. They have Deontay Johnson. They have George Pickens. If anything, they need a wide receiver that plays on the outside who could utilize the outside very, very well, who could go deep and make crazy catches and work the boundary as well as anybody, because that's where the Steelers wide receivers work best. In Matt Canada's offense, it's the outside. Would I tab a wide receiver as the Steelers' 17th pick? No. Would I predict that it's even on their list? No. I would say that if nobody else is available, and if Paris Johnson and all the corners, including Deonte Banks, is gone, and the Steelers are sitting there at 17, and their options are Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, maybe Emmanuel Forbes, and I still think they'd consider Emmanuel Forbes over both wide receivers. I think that they're going to sit there and they're going to say, well, wide receiver is important, but we could get another one in the second round or the third round, and we've had very good success doing so in years past. Why would we change that formula now? I'm not against a star wide receiver, especially for a second-year quarterback. I am very much so on board with adding as many weapons to Kenny Pickett's arsenal as possible, even if it meant leaving Dan Moore Jr. as the left tackle. But I don't think that the Steelers view it the same way. And I don't think that the Steelers offense utilizes these guys as much as they need to. Maybe that'll change in Kenny Pickett's year 2, but I don't know. Until proven otherwise, I'm going to look at it the same way I've been looking at it. The Steelers need a wide receiver, but they have much more pressing needs in the first round that can make a much bigger impact on this team and on this offense at pick 17. All Steelers Talk has officially launched their own clothing brand, Black and Gold Apparel, now available on bonfire.com or at the shop tab at our YouTube page. Your new favorite place for Steelers t-shirts, sweatshirts, and crew necks, now out, now available in multiple designs, including some of my favorites, Kenny Comeback, Mute, and Kenny DeGeorge. Check them all out at bonfire.com or on the shop tab at our YouTube page.